So in this video, we're going to be talking about the different things that are in blood. We're also going to be talking about the process that it takes in order to clot. So to start off today, we have three different components in blood. So when you give a blood sample, you might see the little vial that they take from you looks like red. When they take it to the lab, they will put it in a machine and centrifuge it. And basically, what that does, it spins it really, really quickly and separates its parts. So we have three different components. We have this yellow component, the white component, and the darker red component. So plasma. Plasma is this yellow part. It's about 55% of our blood. It's mostly water, and it also has some other things like proteins and hormones and platelets and nutrients and wastes that are carried in the plasma. That's like the liquid that makes up our blood. So the liquid portion of our blood is plasma, and then we have two portions that make up the solid portion of our blood. So the first one is called leukocytes, which are white blood cells. And this is about less than 1% of our blood would be a leukocyte. So this section right here would be leukocytes. And our white blood cells, we'll talk about later, have specific functions in the immune response. So basically fighting off infections from bacteria or viruses. And then erythrocytes, which is this part right here, it's about 44% of our blood, and they are biconcave discs. They're red blood cells. They look like this. Biconcave means they have a concave shape on both sides of them. So they almost look like a little donut, but doesn't have quite a hole in the middle. It's got just a really, really skinny piece in the middle. And they are what carry oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide in our blood. When our blood is all mixed together, that's what makes our blood look red, is the erythrocytes or the red blood cells. So our blood has a lot of different functions. It's super important. It, first of all, transports materials around our body. It also makes sure that we have certain concentrations of substances like water or salts, and also make sure that we can stay warm. So depending on where we send our blood, whether it's to the skin or we keep it in the core of our body, we can regulate our temperature. And some of the things that we do to transport around our body, we have nutrients that gets absorbed in our small intestine into our blood and eventually gets taken to different cells in our body that need that nutrients. It also carries carbon dioxide and oxygen eventually to the lungs so that we can exchange those, and also goes to our cells if we're taking oxygen. It also takes bad things that we don't want and sends it to the kidneys so that we can get rid of it through the process of excretion, which creates urine. And also carries hormones which control our body and tell our body what to do. So some really important things that blood transports. So the first type of cell that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail is called the red blood cells, or the erythrocytes. So this again is about 44% of our blood. They're usually talked about using for oxygen transport. That's its main function. And most of the time when they're mature, they don't have a nucleus. And the reason for that is because they don't really have to do anything. They just get pushed around in the blood. They don't have to really think about stuff. They use diffusion, which just uses a concentration gradient to take things in or push things out. So they don't need a thing in the cell that tells it what to do, because the blood moves it around and it just uses simple processes like diffusion to allow things in and out of it. You have about 28 million molecules of hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is what connects the oxygen to it, and it makes it so it can transport that oxygen to a different place in the body. And it needs iron in order to do that process. Without iron, you wouldn't be able to carry as much oxygen, which causes something called anemia. So anemia is just basically less oxygen getting to your cells for a number of different reasons. So I have these two pictures. This is a normal blood sample, so someone who does not have anemia. This is someone who does have anemia. So you can see that they have a lot less red blood cells. These are the red blood cells. A lot less of them. And even the ones that they do have, you can see have almost like no color to them. It looks like they're completely hollow in the inside. They have a lot bigger spaces in the middle, and that's because they lack hemoglobin in them, so they're not able to contain the hemoglobin, and iron make the red blood cells the color that they are. So because they're lacking the hemoglobin, they don't kind of show up as well underneath the microscope. So anemia could be because of that iron deficiency. There's also other types of anemia that we're not really going to get into in Science 30. So these are the different types of white blood cells that we have. So they're also called leukocytes. The three different types are granulocytes. So there's three different types of granulocytes called neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils, and they circulate the blood and basically kill any foreign body, which is like a virus or a bacteria that enters our body. We also have monocytes. Monocytes are doing the same thing. They're destroying bad stuff, but they're able to basically leave the bloodstream if they have to, go into different tissues and destroy anything that comes into our body. And then lymphocytes are the ones that make antibodies. Antibodies are going to help us defend our body against those viruses or bacteria, and then we can remember them later, so that we can make sure that we don't get sick with the same illness later. So we also have something called a platelet. Platelets are really small fragments of cells. They're not actually a cell themselves, they're pieces of cells. And they are able to help us with blood clotting, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, to make sure that if we get a cut or a bruise, we're not internally bleeding or bleeding out when that happens. So making sure that we can protect our body from blood loss, because losing blood is not great because of all the really important things that it does, like maintains our body temperature, transporting all those nutrients and oxygen and carbon dioxide and all that fun stuff. So we want to make sure we have blood in our body. So we got to do that with our platelets and protect our blood. So this is just a quick little thing. It's not in your notes, but you can just, so you can visualize kind of what these cells look like. So red blood cells are biconcave discs. Platelets are little fragments, so they're really small in comparison to an actual blood cell. And white blood cells, we have a bunch of different kinds. So lymphocytes are the ones that make antibodies. They look like this. They have a really large nucleus. We also have a bunch of blood cells that eat and destroy stuff. So the monocytes were quite large. They have kind of a funny shaped nucleus. Granulocytes, which, remember, there was three different types. The neutrophils, those are the most common, have multiple different nuclei in it. The basophils have really large kind of purpley dots, and eosinophils are really bright orangey red colored. So these ones are less common. Neutrophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes are the most common white blood cells that you would see. But again, not in your notes. I just wanted to quickly show you guys so you guys could kind of visualize what I was talking about. So now we're going to talk about blood clotting and how that works. So you guys have a little space to write this information, and then I'm going to go through it a little bit more in detail underneath, so you have like two pictures to draw. So starting with enzyme catalyzed reactions. So basically a bunch of enzymes in our bloodstream will tell the platelets what to do, and the platelets will do this process of forming a blood clot. So we need these enzymes called prothrombin, which we turn into thrombin. And eventually we'll take something called fibrinogen and break it into fibrin. And fibrin is super important because it is basically what reinforces a clot and makes sure that you can actually trap the blood from escaping. It's really, really, really sticky, and it's what forms like scabs on the outside of your skin, is mostly fibrin material. So that probably doesn't make any sense, but we're going to write it down, and then I'll explain it a little bit more in detail so you guys can write what I'm writing down next. Underneath this, where it says draw the picture of the process of blood clotting. Now we know kind of these words, but I'll explain a little bit more in detail how that works. So you have a really, really small blood vessel that kind of goes between all of your body cells called the capillaries, and there's blood that goes inside of it. You have red blood cells that travel in. You also have little things called platelets. Okay, there would also be white blood cells, but not important for this process, so I thought I would just ignore them for now. So what happens when we injure ourselves? You would break a capillary, and that blood would be exposed to your body tissues like the skin or fat that are around those capillaries when we get a cut. So these platelets are exposed to that body tissue because the blood is exposed to it. And that's the first thing that triggers this process. The platelet basically touches a body cell and it's like, oh, that's not something I'm supposed to be touching. This is not good. We need to fix this. So the second thing that's going to happen is they're going to signal each other, the platelets, and they're all going to basically run towards that opening or flow towards that opening and really quickly kind of stop the blood from flowing out of that opening. But the problem with this is platelets are not sticky, so this is a really temporary fix. But as blood pushes through the capillary, unfortunately, it's really easy to kind of push past these platelets that have all blocked the opening. So we need to kind of come in and reinforce that with fibrin. And it's kind of a process to make fibrin. Because fibrin is really sticky, we don't want it to be fibrin in our blood all the time. So instead we have fibrinogen, which is fibrin, but it has this cap on it. So fibrin is just the kind of arrow thing, but it's really, really, really sticky on this side. So if we just let fibrin float around, it will find other fibrins and stick to each other and form a blood clot when we don't want it. So this is really important that we don't do this, because if we have a blood clot that travels to our heart and goes into our coronary arteries, it can cause us to have a heart attack. If we have a blood clot that travels to our brain, it's called an aneurysm. So you can die from either of those things. So we want to make sure that we're only clotting the blood when we have an injury. We're not doing it any other time. So in order to do this, there is that cascade of process to form these kind of strings of fibrin to eventually reinforce that blood clot. So in order to do that, I am going to take those enzymes that I was talking about before. So prothrombin looks like this, and it has these calcium ions that are connected to them. So basically, these little circles kind of connected on either side. And when I remove the calcium, I now have this little spot that can pull off that head on fibrinogen and turn it into fibrin. Again, I'm having all of these kind of mechanisms to stop forming fibrin unless it's absolutely necessary, because I don't want to form a blood clot unless I actually want to, because otherwise you could end up passing away from that. So I don't want to have a really easy process, because then I could accidentally do it just randomly. I want to make sure that I'm protecting my body and making sure that there's multiple different steps to this process to make it a little bit more difficult for my body so that I can only do it when it's necessary. So once I have the thrombin, which is the prothrombin basically with the calcium removed, it fits perfectly on the fibrinogen, and then I can take that fibrinogen cap off and the fibrin will just basically form a long chain. So once I form the long chain of fibrin, it's going to go ahead and just kind of wrap around the platelets that have formed that little blockade and really reinforce that platelet plug so that we make sure that it stays there permanently and we don't have blood flowing past it. So in real life, if you saw this underneath a microscope, this is what a fibrin and platelet and basically a blood clot would look like if I zoomed in on it. So all of these yellow pieces, it almost looks like a spider web, is the fibrin. And the reason why when you get a scab on the outside of your skin, it looks red, it's not because of the fibrin. The fibrin isn't red. What happens is red blood cells will get caught in the the blood clot, which isn't a bad thing. It just kind of helps reinforce it. And that's why a scab looks red. So that is a process of blood clotting. So you had two different pictures that you had to draw. I think the second picture makes a little bit more sense. It's a little bit more in depth and hopefully makes sense. So there's those, and now you know all the different parts of the blood, all the different cells. So hopefully that makes sense as well. Hopefully you guys have a great day. Talk to you later.